alert. Kaboom. Kaboom. Another boat off of the coast of Venezuela just got blown to smithereens. And these weren't fishermen on a shipwrecked crew. They were bad hombres, narco-terrorists. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth ordered the lethal kinetic strike earlier today as part of Operation Southern Spear. 2 narco-terrorists are reportedly dead. This comes just after Trump gave Maduro a late Christmas gift, a missile to Venezuela's drug-loading docks.
There was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs, so we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
Maduro thought Trump was bluffing when he threw around the idea of land strikes. Guess not. The docks are about as close to home as it gets. Guess the dictator should have listened to all of the warning shots.
You have to understand what he's done. They've sent billions of dollars of drugs in. But maybe just as bad, they've sent hundreds of thousands of people in from jails, from prisons, from mental institutions and insane asylums, the drug lords, the drug dealers. Every boat that we take out, we save 25,000 lives of Americans.
Oh, Maduro, you've been a naughty fellow, and your country now isn't so mellow. Because strikes are falling on land, you, my good sir, are outmanned. It's not just Christmas for old dictator Nick. There are a few others on the naughty list who deserve a big old kick. We're not just talking about you, Ilhan. Our eyes are on the state of Iran.
I hope they're not trying to build up again, because if they are, we're going to have no choice but very quickly to eradicate that buildup. So I hope Iran is not trying to build up. I hope they're not doing it, because we don't want to waste the fuel on a B-2. It's a 37-hour trip both ways. I don't want to waste a lot of fuel.
When Trump says don't, he means it. If Hamas doesn't stop the shenanigans, they're getting wiped out too.
If they don't disarm, as they agreed to do, they agreed to it, and then they'll be held to pay for them.
Trump's calling the shots around the world right from his Mar-a-Lago escape. Not only did Trump throw his swanky Christmas party, but he had lots of visitors too. Today, Bibi came and gave his favorite president the grandest of gifts.
We decided to break a convention too, or create a new one, and that is to award the Israel Prize, which in almost our 80 years, we've never awarded it to a non-Israeli, and we're going to award it this year to President Trump. This was announced formally over lunch by our Minister of Education, who's responsible for the Israel Prize. It's going to be awarded to President Donald J. Trump for his tremendous contributions to Israel and the Jewish people.
And Trump is reminding the world who got the job done.
Put it this way, every hostage just about that's been released was released because of me, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, my whole team, Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth. They were all released because of us. None were released in the Biden administration, none.
That is true. Families are together for the first time in 3 years, just in time for the holidays. And all Trump wanted for Christmas was peace. Zelensky came by for Christmas dinner and even wore his best suit. Trump he was in such a great mood that he even threw some food at the press.
Outside and have some food. Would you like to have food, or do you consider that a bribe? And therefore you cannot write honestly, or therefore you have to write a bad story. Okay, because if you'd like, would you like something to eat at this time? Yes or no? You can speak.
Yes, sir.
Yes? Okay. Margot,
yes, sir.
Take them outside, tell the chef, serve them a little lunch, okay?
And they were so thankful, he offered them lunch again today.
Like you can come up and have lunch like you did yesterday. Would you like that or not? Do you want that? Because some of them think it's terrible, it's a bribe. But, you know, a bribe for $25, I don't know. If you'd like, you can go, and if you don't, you can stand in a driveway and melt.
Z loved Palm Beach too. So much, he's starting to ask, DC who?
He walked in, he said, this place is gorgeous. I don't think he wants to go to the White House anymore. That's the problem.
I'm ready to go to the White House.
I know. It is, the White House is a very special place. And so is this. I hope you enjoyed it.
Trump loves being the gracious host, especially when he had a peace deal ready for dessert. Sources say a deal between Russia and Ukraine is closer than ever. If Trump has to go to Kiev to get the deal through, he will.
I've offered to go and speak to their parliament. And, you know, if that would help, I don't know if that would help. I think it would probably help, but I don't even know if that's...
You're welcome.
Yeah, no, I know.
Always.
So I'm not sure that it would be really necessary, but if it would help save 25,000 lives a month or whatever it may be, I would certainly be willing to do that.
And Putin might be ready to salsa dance too.
I saw a very interesting President Putin today. I mean, he wants to see it happen. He wants to see it. He told me very strongly. I believe him. Don't forget, we went through the Russia hoax together. I think we're going to get there. I know him very well. I was on the phone with him for almost, I guess, 2.5 hours. They're just telling me now. It's a long time. We discussed a lot of things. We didn't talk about the weather.
Although Zelensky isn't so sure.
Is there any indication that you see that Vladimir Putin wants peace by what he's doing or saying?
Me not, be honest. And I don't see it because, first of all, I don't hear it publicly. His messages, he doesn't speak about peace. Now he doesn't speak. He says that he can go further. It's not the signals of peace.
Trump knows the war is a lose-lose for both sides. And the longer it goes, the worse it gets.
What happens in a few weeks if things sputter? What are you prepared to do?
They keep fighting, and they keep dying. No good. But if things don't happen, they keep fighting, and they keep dying. And we don't want that to happen. He doesn't want it to happen. President Putin doesn't want it to happen either.
The president's ready to get this war over with so he can shift his full attention back to where it matters, our own backyard. And he has his A-team handling it. Even MSNBC knows it.
I think the establishment in Washington has something to learn from Trump's unconventional diplomacy, totally breaking diplomatic precedent. Look at his diplomats. I call them cowboy diplomats, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff. They have no experience, and yet sometimes they get stuff done.
The Biden doctrine who? There's a new sheriff in town, and everyone knows his motto. Mess around and find out.
New reports just into the Situation Room that Russia is accusing Ukraine of attacking one of President Vladimir Putin's residences overnight. It's a claim that the Ukrainian President Zelensky strongly denies. CNN senior international correspondent Fred Pleitgen is joining us right now. Fred, you've spent a lot of time reporting from Moscow. What do you make of this accusation?
Yeah, it came from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Wolf, I would say about an hour, maybe a little bit more before or ago. And this was a press conference from Sergei Lavrov with some audio where he accused the Ukrainians of attacking a residence of Vladimir Putin in the Novgorod region, which is fairly close to Moscow. Now, the Russians are saying that 91 UAVs, drones, were used in this attack, that these drones were shot down, and that there are no reports of casualties. Now, the Russians, of course, irate about all of this. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, Wolf, coming out and saying that the Russians are going to have to rethink their negotiating position, accusing the Ukrainians of terrorism. And the Ukrainians themselves, by the way, also very quick to react to all of this. In fact, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, denying that the Ukrainians attacked this residence, claiming that the Russians are trying to stoke discord between the United States and Ukraine, of course, right after that very important meeting took place between Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and President Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago yesterday. So the Ukrainians unequivocally saying that they did not attack Vladimir Putin's residence, whereas the Russians are saying that this did happen, that they are going to rethink their negotiating position vis-a-vis the Ukrainians and trying to end the conflict in Ukraine because of this attack, Wolf.
So are they any closer at all right now to a deal to end this war?
Well, we just heard a couple of minutes ago, Wolf, that apparently President Trump just finished a phone call with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. We are still waiting to get some sort of readout from that, from the Russian side and from the U.S. side as well. One of the senior envoys of the Russians, Kirill Dmitriev, called these talks vital for peace, but it's unclear how much closer the sides really are to reaching some sort of agreement. One of the things that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, said is he said that more than 90% of the sticking points he believes have been sorted out, but that there are still two key issues that have not been sorted out. One of them is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, one of the biggest power plants, nuclear power plants in the world, currently held by Russia, but the Ukrainians obviously saying that this is their power plant, and what to do with that is still being sorted out. But the main issue remains the issue of territories, and if and what territories the Ukrainians would have to cede to the Russians as part of any peace agreement. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukraine's president, saying a referendum would be necessary in order to do that. However, he also says that for a referendum to happen, they need a 60-day ceasefire. The Russians are saying that is absolutely not going to happen. They believe that the Ukrainians are going to regroup, so it's going to be very interesting to see what President Trump and Vladimir Putin spoke about in that phone call and whether or not any headway was made in that regard, Wolf.
All right, Fred Pleitgen reporting for us. Fred, thank you very much.
I want to just get your take on something that Fred Pleitgen, our reporter on the ground there in Berlin, mentioned. This idea that the Ukrainians believe that this is Russia's attempt to sow discord between the US and Ukraine. Also, they're using it as a pretense, potentially, for more attacks. And then also another pretense to get out of this potential peace plan. What's your take on that? Is this sort of a ruse, an excuse by Russia to try to wriggle out of this peace deal?
I think that's very possible, Zaid, and I think Fred's exactly right. These are certain ways in which Russia has done this in the past. They try to create a situation where they will take an incident that may or may not have been a direct attack on the residence of Vladimir Putin, one of the residences of Vladimir Putin in the Novgorod region, and make it a bigger thing than it actually is. It could be that there was an errant drone that went there instead of to its intended target. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that it was a false flag operation, at least that part of it, that the Russians were using that, and they may have decided to go after, make it seem as if there's a Ukrainian drone, but it was really one of their own that they then shot down conveniently. But there are a lot of different things that we don't know yet, so there's obviously some degree of speculation here, Zain. But I would definitely say that the Russians have had the tendency in the past to try to wiggle out of these negotiations. They believe they have the military advantage right now, and they're going to do whatever they can to prosecute that advantage to, in essence, gain more territory in Ukraine, to gain a more advantageous negotiating position. Those are the kinds of things that they're seeking, and they think that they can do that, especially during these winter months.
Assuming that this peace plan hasn't completely derailed based on this latest lines that we're just getting here, Zelensky is talking about the fact that he's actually willing to bring up this plan for a referendum, assuming that there can be some kind of 60-day temporary ceasefire. If he puts forward a proposal to the Ukrainian people about potentially giving up land concessions to Russia, which way is that likely to go?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't seen any polling figures, but I know that a lot of Ukrainians are looking at this as, they don't want to exchange land for peace. Now, some do, so this may be a fairly close-run thing if they think that they can get peace and that they think they have adequate security guarantees to make that happen. But if they think that they don't have adequate security guarantees, if the Russians, let's say, attack in the middle of the election process, then it would probably tip the scales to a rejection of a plan like that. And so what President Zelensky can do, if, let's say, this plan is rejected, he can say, well, I gave it to my people, I gave it as a referendum, provided it to them, I put it forward for their consideration, and they rejected it. He is basically not a loser either way. Whether if he wins that referendum or if the referendum is approved, he gets to win. If that referendum is on the losing side, he also says, well, I tried, I followed the Constitution of Ukraine, and this is where we are right now. But there are certain consequences, of course, to each of those actions, and especially if the referendum were to be rejected, then what that would mean, Zain, is that it would be, probably a continuation of the conflict as we know it right now. So more of attrition, more, stalemates on the front, basically.
We're being told that both sides are closer to peace than they've ever been, but there are still a lot of headwinds that remain, not to mention obviously the issue with land concessions if there is some kind of referendum, but also what happens with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And then on top of that, you throw into mix the latest accusations by Russia about Ukraine potentially attacking one of Putin's residences. We'll see what happens. Colonel Cedric Layton, live for us there. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Well, let's go straight to our Elena Treen joining us live now from Washington. So Elena, just walk us through what we know about this phone call between Vladimir Putin and President Trump, especially in light of the allegations that Moscow is saying that Ukraine has tried to attack, or rather attacked, one of Putin's residences. And what does that do to the peace talks here?
Yeah, I mean, it already, Zain, puts these very fragile peace talks in a more precarious position. We don't have much details from the call this morning between the president and Russian President Vladimir Putin. All I was able to get from the White House was White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told me that the president just moments ago wrapped up that call with Putin and that essentially it was a positive call concerning Ukraine. Now, of course, we know that the goal of this call was to walk Putin through what President Trump had discussed with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday during that more than 3-hour-long meeting at his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida. But Look, this is very much a wait-and-see kind of process. This is what I'm continuing to hear in my conversations with people, behind the scenes who are working on this peace proposal. I will say we did hear kind of optimistic rhetoric from President Trump yesterday after they emerged, like I said, from that 3 hours long meeting. He saying that he believes they are closer now to a deal than they have ever been. We also heard from Zelensky. He said this prior to the meeting, but also after the meeting, that he believes that at least on the U.S. side, the U.S. and the Ukrainians have agreed to roughly 90% of the terms in this proposed 20-point peace plan. But it really is that remaining 10% that is the thorniest. In addition to what Russia is now accusing Ukraine of, we also know that there's a lot of questions over security guarantees. We heard Zelensky say yesterday that he believes the U.S. is now agreeing or going to agree to a 15-year security guarantee for Ukraine in a potential deal. But also this idea of land concessions. Will they be willing, both sides, to remove troops from the Donbas region? It's very unclear. Zelensky seemed to signal he might be open to that, and then he said that yesterday. And then today we've seen Zelensky actually posting repeatedly on social media, on X, saying that he doesn't believe that Russia is really,
De La Quatara, and former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and MS Now International Affairs analyst Michael McFaul. Good to have you both. Ines, I'll start with you. So, look, it sounds like coming out of that meeting, there were positive vibes from President Trump and from Zelensky. But the reality is here, Putin's posturing really at no point has fundamentally changed. So are we looking at progress, or are we still where we started?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question here. And you're right. We certainly heard optimism from all sides, really. As of this morning, you heard it there in those clips. You had President Trump talking about progress being made. You had Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that they were 90% of the way there. You even had the Russians, as of this morning, saying that they agreed with President Trump's assessment that they were closer to a deal than ever before. I will say, over the course of the day, the situation has significantly changed. So you now have the Russians accusing the Ukrainians of attempting to attack Putin's residence in the Novgorod region with drones. The Ukrainians are denying that. They say this is just another round of Russian lies, but the Russians are now saying they're going to have to revise their negotiating position in light of this attack. And President Trump was asked about all of this earlier as he was speaking to reporters. I'll let you listen to what he had to say.
Yeah, I don't like it. It's not good. I heard about it this morning.
Did Putin tell you
know
about
who told me about it? President Putin told me about it. Early in the morning, he said he was attacked. That's no good. It's no good.
Russian officials
don't forget, the Tomahawks. I stopped the Tomahawks. I didn't want that. Because we're talking about, it's a delicate period of time. This is not the right time. It's one thing to be offensive, because they're offensive. It's another thing to attack his house. It's not the right time to do any of that. And can do it. And I learned about it from President Putin today. I was very angry about it.
And the Ukrainians say this is really the Russians trying to hinder progress and efforts that were made over the weekend. Conversations in Florida. The Russians are pointing the finger right back at the Ukrainians, accusing them of doing the same thing. So we're waiting for more information on that alleged attack on Putin's residence, but that will likely become more of an issue in the coming days.
Ambassador, I want to get your gut reaction to that. It's interesting to see the president's posturing there, saying that he spoke to Putin. He doesn't like it. He seemed genuinely sort of offended on Putin's behalf there. And it was interesting because in his remarks yesterday, as he stood with Zelensky, you had to remember, in the backdrop of all of that, ballistic missiles from Russia were hitting Ukraine over the weekend as they were allegedly there to talk peace. And Trump was at that time saying that he sort of took Putin at his word, that he was interested in rebuilding Ukraine. So how do you read that, I guess, that he seems here to be sort of more emotionally invested in, I guess, Putin's version of the story than he has been in Ukraine's?
Tragically, that's true. It's frustrating to me personally because he's taking the side of the guy that started this war, that he invaded Ukraine. He annexed territory. He terrorizes and kills civilians every single day. You're showing footage of it right now. He has kidnapped children, and it's a dictatorship invading a democracy. And yet never has President Trump empathized or shown sympathy for the Ukrainian side in this war. And yet, after one phone call that hasn't been, the allegation of this attack has not been confirmed by anyone, including our own intelligence community, he immediately sides with President Putin. And that is a tragedy, because that does not serve America's national interests to be siding with the imperial dictator and throwing under the bus the sovereign democratic country of Ukraine. I just don't think it serves our interests in general, and in specifics of this negotiation. I do think this is a way for Putin to deflect from the progress that might have been made in Mar-a-Lago.
I mean, beyond our personal self-interest, Ambassador, how do you think the Europeans, the rest of the world, is watching this?
Well, everybody publicly has to put on a good face. I mean, I think if you saw President Zelensky's face yesterday when President Trump said, Putin just wants what's good for Ukraine. He just wants to help Ukraine. You saw he couldn't contain himself, but he didn't respond to it, nor will any Europeans, because everybody agrees that in order to find a solution to end this horrific, barbaric invasion of Ukraine, they have to keep President Trump engaged. And that's why they're going to all of these efforts to keep talking to them. Europeans, it sounds like, are going to come in January to keep talking to them, because they don't want him to slide back to his default position, which is to support Putin, which we saw this morning in those comments that you just showed.
He also made some comments about how the U.S. is allegedly safe because conveniently there's an ocean that separates us and the Russians. Take a listen to some of his remarks.
They've spent a lot of money on helping Ukraine. And look, they're doing it for themselves also, meaning their country, because Ukraine's a very important country for them in particular. For us, it's very important. To me, it's their lives. You know, we're thousands and thousands of miles. We're protected by a thing called the Atlantic Ocean and lots of other places, to be honest. And they're not, you know, they're right there. But we're working together with them as we should be. But I'm doing it to save lives.
Ambassador, given the Russians' history of cyber attacks, attempted election interference, are we safe from Russian aggression because there's an ocean in the way?
Well, first, I want to applaud the president for caring about saving lives. I appreciate that he says that. I wish he'd say more about Ukrainian civilians, but that's a laudable goal. But the idea that the oceans protect us is about 100 years out of date. They didn't protect us during World War II. They most certainly don't protect us against cyber attacks, as you rightly pointed out, or ICBM missiles. This is not the 19th century. Those oceans do not protect us. And what I fear, because the president believes that, is he is going back to this kind of 19th century idea that what happens in Europe doesn't matter to us, what happens in Asia doesn't matter to us because we're protected. That was actually a very dangerous idea in the 1930s, the height of isolationism. America First was very strong back then, and people believed that attacks on China by Japan didn't affect us, or Hitler and Stalin invading Poland. We found out very tragically on December 7th, 1941, that those oceans did not defend us, and it dragged us into World War II. We can't repeat that again today.
Ines, if the U.S. starts moving toward what the ambassador just described there, a sort of 1930s version of the old world order, what will Europeans have to do, or what are they actually already doing now to prepare for a reality in which the U.S. no longer sees itself as a sort of guiding moral and physical presence in that part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, the Europeans are watching this very concerned. I know, French officials I've been speaking to here in Paris are certainly concerned that these negotiations will not go in the right directions, that Trump may force Ukraine to make too many concessions to the Russians, and that the war could eventually start up again down the line, and the Europeans will have to figure it out on their own, that Trump will tire of negotiating this peace deal, or that he just will decide to no longer help Ukraine, and the Europeans will be left to fend for themselves. They are trying to, guide these negotiations in the right direction. They are pushing for security guarantees. That's been a big point of conversation in recent days. And I will say that there was progress made on that front over the weekend in Florida. We heard from the Ukrainian president that the U.S. had agreed to provide Ukraine with 15 years of security guarantees for Ukraine. The Ukraine would like those security guarantees to go on for longer.
And I'm sure Putin doesn't want them to get any security guarantees. Ines de la Cuetara and Ambassador Michael McFaul, good to see you both. Thank you so much.
Bellavia, Medal of Honor recipient. Thank you, sir, so much for joining us. First of all, thank you for your service and your sacrifice to this country. Really do appreciate it. But with that being said, you have quite the experience here. Explain to us what you see. How do you see President Trump executing because because he is really taking action against these narco terrorists.
Well, Jason, I can't believe we're having this conversation. As tough as it is to be a narco-terrorist today in Venezuela, it's got to be more difficult to be a Democratic surrogate going on national TV and defending narco-terrorists every single day. There are people watching this right now, tens of thousands of Americans that are connected to or know someone that has died of an overdose. And what have we been force-fed? In my hometown of Buffalo, New York, I've got a health commissioner. I've got a lame Erie County executive that is telling people to do cocaine with a buddy. They're shooting Narcan into the crowd like a t-shirt cannon. This has been the Democratic liberal answer to drugs for the longest time. Now we got a president who's turning the waterways of Venezuela into Shark Week every single day. And he's telling the world, if you want to trade crude oil with Iran, if you want to enable our adversaries, if you want to bring your gangs, your drug lords, your terrorists across the border. We talk about Tren de Aragua in Venezuela. Jason, you and I both know Tren de Aragua is in Michigan. It's in New York. It's in all 50 states of the United States of America. We finally have a president that's actually backing up the words that we hear on a campaign trail, and he's sticking up for the American people, saying 100,000 overdoses a year is not going to happen on his watch, and 106 dead narco-terrorists. If there's any investigation that needs to be done, why isn't that number 500? Who is defending this? Who's defending these actions? These are Venezuelans in league with Iran, in league with Russia, in league with our enemy, and they're killing American citizens. That's what our military is for.
Well, to your point, Democratic Congressman Robert Garcia just doesn't understand why Trump would go after these boats. Have a look at this.
It's hard to understand are essentially strikes on boats, strikes now likely within the country of Venezuela, with no real explanation from the administration as to why they're happening. They're saying that they're taking on drugs coming into the U.S. Yet some of these boats we know weren't even coming into the U.S.
Your quick thoughts on this one?
I mean, Congressman Garcia would probably also question why Luke Skywalker didn't offer habeas corpus to the defenders of the Death Star. These aren't serious people, and they don't have solutions to the problems. Donald Trump was elected to fix these problems. He's doing that, and he's using our military to do that.
Welcome to the NewsHour. It is exceedingly rare that a U.S. president would announce covert action publicly, but that is what President Trump did yesterday when he acknowledged a strike on a port facility in Venezuela. And today, media outlets reported it was the CIA that launched the drone strike on an alleged drug facility. It comes as the Trump administration is targeting not only drug smugglers across the region, but also Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro himself.
For months, the U.S. has built up the Caribbean's largest armada in half a century. 30 strikes on what the U.S. calls narco-terrorist drug boats, the latest in the Eastern Pacific just last night. The capture of 2 sanctioned Venezuelan oil tankers and the chasing of a third tanker that today reportedly requested Russian protection. And today, news the CIA reportedly launched a drone strike along the Venezuelan coast. The reported target, a storage facility operated by the transnational gang Tren de Aragua, which the Trump administration connects without public evidence to Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro.
There was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs. So we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
If the amount of drug trafficking comes down significantly in the Caribbean, and I think it must, the regime is going to have a lot less money to throw around.
Elliot Abrams was the first Trump administration's special envoy for Venezuela and is today a senior fellow for the Council on Foreign Relations. He supports the pressure campaign that is targeting Venezuela's chief source of revenue as a way to weaken Maduro's grip on power and force him to step down.
The economy of Venezuela will get worse, and the finances of the Maduro regime will get worse. And that will increase public pressure and internal pressure in the regime. That at some point there are either mass demonstrations, or somebody in the military acts, or the regime basically decides, we don't know how far Trump is willing to go with this, let's make a deal now.
But the administration's critics argue the pressure campaign's tactics are illegal and its goals are imperialist.
It's straightforward territorial intervention. It's the kind of thing that was characteristic of the United States in the Caribbean region back in the beginnings of the 20th century.
Daniel Hellinger is a Webster University professor emeritus who says Maduro is not the threat that the U.S. alleges.
I don't think he's sort of the kingpin that they're trying to portray him to be. Venezuela does not traffic in fentanyl to any significant degree, and that most of what comes out of Venezuela is more likely to be marijuana or cocaine, and even at that doesn't even come towards the United States.
Us people.
Maduro himself this week has been trying to laugh or sing past the pressure, in between boasts and bravado.
Our military have a glorious history as emancipating, humanist, invincible warriors. Today, our armed forces are more prepared than ever to continue winning peace, sovereignty, and territorial integrity for our people.
And opponents of the Trump administration's policy predict that if Maduro is ousted, there'll be chaos.
Venezuela is a heavily armed society in the civilian sector. There are going to be parts of the Venezuelan military that will retreat into guerrilla warfare, and there's just a very dense population in Caracas where crime is a serious problem, and there's lots of firearms around. So it'll get messy.
The warnings that there will be civil war in Venezuela and massive amounts of violence, I think, are wrong. That if Maduro falls, Edmundo Gonzalez, who was elected last year, will become president. And the opposition is planning for that right now and planning for what a democratic transition will look like. As long as the Maduro regime is there, we are not going to get its cooperation in reducing drug trafficking. You're going to see the continuing flow of migrants, 8 million now, and there's no reason that it can't go to 9 or 10 or 12 million over the coming years. And you're going to see continuing cooperation between the regime and Cuba, Iran, Russia, China.
Maduro has not acknowledged the alleged CIA strike, perhaps to avoid further escalation. But more confrontation is coming, as the U.S. is promising more pressure.
And joining us now, MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde, president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. He's also the author of the weekly Substack newsletter Home and Away, retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, former commander of U.S. Army Europe, and Hofstra University professor of law James Sample, an expert in constitutional law. David, I'll begin with you to help lay the groundwork here. What exactly do we know at this time about the CIA strike that took place last week?
So the CIA is declining to comment. As are members of Congress, this kind of strike, the Gang of Eight, this would be the members of Congress from both parties who serve on the intelligence committees and other senior congressional officials should know about these kind of strikes. The sense that they're not commenting suggests that they did occur. And since it would be classified and they can't comment on them, it was a dock that, as you've talked about, was apparently used by a cartel or drug traffickers to transit drugs out of Venezuela. But this is a dramatic escalation, A, because it's attack on Venezuela itself. B, it's a shift back to this idea of somehow pressuring the flow of drugs as a way to get at Maduro. And as you mentioned, the main thrust last week and what seemed to be a more effective tactic was trying to shut off the flow of oil from Venezuela. That's what really threatens the Maduro regime. And then our colleague, David Noriega, an MS Now reporter, he's heard from people who support aggressive action against Maduro that they're frustrated. They want the administration to be more aggressive in its use of force or more consistent in its tactics, and that this kind of back and forth and shifting in tactics and explanations may be emboldening Maduro.
You know, James, there are more than a few premises this administration has asked us to accept without sharing with us hard public evidence. But even if you're accepting or arguing that these people are terrorists or they are enemy combatants, is it legal to strike a dock in a sovereign nation?
The rhetoric and the labels help a lot in the court of public opinion. They may help ultimately in domestic courts as well. But on an international law level, let's be clear, there are two options. This is either illegal under international humanitarian law, which the United States subscribes to, or it's illegal under the law of armed conflict. One of those two scenarios applies. The United States is arguing in a secret OLC memo that no one has seen outside the administration that this is an armed conflict with Venezuela. Now, the administration certainly has the power to make that reality true. They can make that manifest, right, by creating an armed conflict. But if this is an international armed conflict and therefore subject to the law of armed conflict, these individuals individual actions. For example, the boat strikes on individuals who at most, even under the allegations and even under the labels, are guilty of criminal activity. That is activity that is the subject of law enforcement, not murder.
Richard, look, the justification for these strikes, the story around these strikes just keeps shifting. First, of course, we're told this is all about the drug war. Then Susie Wiles, of course, close to Trump, leading operations in the White House. You know, she makes comments in that explosive Vanity Fair profile saying that this is about trying to make Maduro cry uncle. And then we start to hear people on the right, figures around President Trump and Trump himself, signal that, well, actually, this might be about oil and resources. Can you help me decode what's going on here?
The fourth option, which is all of the above. I think to some extent, in a very limited way, it's about drugs. It's much more about regime change and gaining access to Venezuelan oil. And I think that a big part of this administration's foreign policy has been what? It has been focusing on the Western Hemisphere, check. It has been commercial opportunity, check. It's also been about stopping immigration. Venezuela has lost over 8 million people over the last, 5 or 10 years. So it seems to me it's central to this administration's foreign policy. The real question is, what if small amounts of gradually increasing military force don't work? Gradualism, incrementalism allows the other side to adjust. So I'm not sure it's the wisest approach, but if a little bit of force doesn't work, well, then what? Do you back off or do you introduce a lot of force? This administration tends to be against large-scale interventions. So I know what they want. Again, like everything else in foreign policy, it's a means-ends challenge, and I'm not sure the means and the ends are lining up here.
General Hertling, as you and I have talked about these strikes sort of one after another as they've occurred. And I'm curious if you're at all concerned about the role of military lawyers right now. Traditionally, at least the public assumes that they are involved in the planning, that they are assessing these actions before they actually happen. But are you at all concerned as you see all of this unfold that what they might actually be doing is finding the story, the justification after the fact?
Extremely concerned about it, Antonio. And it goes back to what David was saying about the legalities. The legalities of international law, the legalities of armed conflict, the legalities associated with what is combat, what is declaring war on another country. Going into sovereign territory violates the UN Charter. It's what we've been talking about, what Russia has been doing for the past 4 years. So we have become somewhat like them in terms of what we're doing illegally to get that end state that Richard was just talking about. And when you talk end state, it's just not ends and means, it's also ways you do things. The other thing I'd bring up too is there's been a lot of talk about the term regime change. That's begun to roll off the tongues of policymakers and even cable news and campaign surrogates. That seems to be the mama bear on the menu of military options. It's less than a full-scale invasion, but it's more than a few boat strikes. But truthfully, regime change is not a military mission. When you start getting into that option where you're really talking about changing a regime, you're running into a whole lot of problem because there are things that have to be done at the State Department, within the intelligence community, to reinforce the military in terms of what they're doing, even if that's the mission you want to accomplish. And the administration doesn't seem to be doing any of those things beyond just using strikes. And that scares me as a military guy who knows the type of planning that goes into these kinds of operations.
I want to go back to the question of regime change in a moment, but James, if you were providing legal advice to a member of the military who's part of the chain of command here involved in these strikes, would you be concerned that they had personal liability for their actions?
I would be concerned. I think I'd be more concerned than seems to be the level of concern that has been the way in which this has been approached so far, at least based on reporting. We do get the sense that there have been some individuals along the chain of command and along the chain of legal advice who have expressed concerns. Those concerns, however, have been overruled, have been dismissed.
And we know from the reporting, too, that some of them are seeking outside counsel.
That's absolutely right. And we've obviously seen high-profile resignations in the military as well. So Yes, is the answer to the question, because basically what we're talking about here with respect to the sovereignty of a nation, look, Maduro is a well-regarded bad guy, right? That is fairly universally acknowledged at this point. But bad guy or not, this particular drone strike in the sovereign territory of another foreign country without that country's consent goes against Article 51 of the UN Charter. The United States isn't under attack in any credible way. And the individuals who are at sea, those are individuals who are miles and miles from any potential harm to the United States and could easily be interdicted without death. These are serious, serious matters as a matter of international law, and eventually, maybe if Congress does its job, as a matter of domestic law as well.
Richard, do you have questions about the role the CIA and the military may have played in this dock strike? It hasn't been entirely clear. Late last week, on the day after Christmas, Donald Trump went on a conservative radio show and boasted about his administration's deadly and possibly illegal airstrikes on civilian boats. However, it was not Trump's celebration of potential war crimes that caught people's attention. It was this moment.
Every time I knock out a boat, we save 25,000 American lives. We just knocked out, I don't know if you read or you saw, they have a big plant or a big facility where they send where the ships come from. 2 nights ago, we knocked that out. So we hit them very hard.
This casual admission, a land strike on Venezuela, would mark a dramatic escalation in Trump's so-called drug war. But we still do not know exactly what happened here. The White House, Pentagon, and CIA all refused to comment on, let alone confirm, Trump's claim. So either Trump bragged about a land strike in Venezuela that did not happen, or as the reporting suggests is more likely, he openly talked about an operation that he was not supposed to. Meanwhile, the New York Times and CNN both reported, citing multiple sources, that it was the CIA that conducted this strike. This reporting, I should note, has not yet been confirmed by MS Now, but Trump seemingly did confirm it when he briefly took questions from reporters alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Can you say anything more about the explosion in Venezuela that you mentioned in a radio interview? Did the military do that? Can you share any more details about that?
Well, it doesn't matter, but there was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs. So we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement.
And joining me now to break down why this escalation is so alarming to many is former Army captain and federal prosecutor Margaret Donovan, who has served in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, along with MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode. It is good to have you both. Margaret, I want to start with you, and I guess I want to begin by underscoring how odd, how mysterious all of this is. Beginning with the fact that it starts with what seemed almost like throwaway comments from the president on a radio show, revealing a covert or potentially covert operation. Is any of this normal, standard practice and procedure? And more importantly, does any of this seem legal to you?
To answer your first question, no, none of this is normal. It is not normal for anybody to disclose a covert operation. This is the second time the president has done that. If you remember, he did it a few months ago when he discussed that he had made a finding to authorize CIA action in Venezuela, essentially making it no longer covert. So that is not normal. But then again, this is an administration that isn't too concerned with operational security or keeping classified information classified. As to whether it's legal, I would say this, and you know my position that this entire campaign against non-combatants in the Caribbean has not been supported by domestic or international legal authority. As to CIA operations, some domestic legal authority for that. We don't really know the facts. We're not even sure what was targeted. Was it drugs? Was it oil? Was it just an empty dock? But no matter.
Now to the first known U.S. strike on Venezuelan soil. President Trump says that the U.S. hit a Venezuelan dock where drugs were allegedly being loaded onto boats, a major escalation in this ongoing military campaign. Questions now swirling over the potential next targets and whether this could escalate into an all-out war. Let's bring in retired Army Colonel Seth Crumich. Seth, great to have you here. Based on what we know, who do you think carried out this strike? Who ordered this strike? How did they do it?
So thanks, Elizabeth. You know, when you look at the messaging that President Trump put out over the last few months, he said the U.S. administration would apply military strikes and covert strikes. Covert strikes being unique messaging from the president because normally those stay in the shadows. So when we look at the initial reports that have come in, it sounds like this was a CIA strike earlier in the month at this logistics port hub that is facilitating the narco network. Now, what's truly unique about this is normally covert actions stay covert. the president has come out and said, hey, we did this. And, you know, the takeaway when I talk to our Global Guardian intelligence teams or our teams in Venezuela or Latin America, we're in agreement that there must be some additional value for the president to come out and highlight the fact that we did this strike, which normally would not be something that we would do. And what I believe is that this is all about pressure on Maduro. We've been doing strikes on drug boats and then seeing what the reaction is from the Maduro regime and the population. Then it was the maritime interdictions of the oil tankers. Then doing an assessment to see what happened there and then figuring out what the next steps were going to be. I think this dock strike is now the next step, and we're going to go into an assessment phase. And if we don't see the results that we're looking for from a U.S. perspective, then you will see follow-on strikes. I think you'll see something more land-based, not necessarily in Caracas, but looking at narco infrastructure, maybe towards the Colombian border, something along those locations. But make no mistake, this is going to continue until the U.S. gets the outcome they want, and I believe that is the ousting of the Maduro government.
Well, that was exactly my next question, Seth, because what is the result that the U.S. wants here? What's the end game as far as you see it?
So the end game is the ouster of Maduro, but make no mistake, let's use the oil vessels as an example. When we grabbed when we took the sanctioned oil vessels over, the reaction in the Venezuelan ports was really astounding. Most of the shadow fleet stayed in port, which means oil wasn't flowing from Venezuela. Well, if the oil's not leaving Venezuela, then money's not coming back into Venezuela. And the so what means this already fragile economy that's suffering from inflation, things are about to get a lot worse. And when that happens, you're going to see revolution ingredients begin to percolate up, and you're going to see real pressure on Maduro. So that's what I'm looking for. This has to be an organic revolution if you're going to remove Maduro and his government. So I'm looking for those after effects, because make no mistake, we can talk about the narco effects, but we truly believe this is about removing that government. And when that happens, there's going to be a potential follow-on effect in Cuba as well.
That's really fascinating to think about the oil, those revenues being lost as a way to kind of spur revolution in Venezuela. Is there any sort of argument there that it's also something that could benefit the U.S., trying to cut off that supply, get access to the oil?
Absolutely. I think for us, it's all about the national security strategy that was released earlier this month. For the first time, as far back as I can remember, and I've been doing this for over 30 years, the national security strategy, it really prioritized the Western Hemisphere as a place that we're going to focus on and really focus our resources, whether they're military, intelligence, economic, with the desired end state to create a more U.S.-friendly and stable Western Hemisphere, removing some of the nefarious players like China, Russia, and Iran, who have deep footprints in Venezuela and Cuba, for example. So when you look at this, it's going to be interesting.
Really interesting. I look forward to hearing more of your insights on this. Colonel Seth Cromick, thanks so much for your time, and happy early New Year to you.
You too. Thank you.
Well, tonight, with the world now wondering about the 10 co-conspirators of Jeffrey Epstein referred to in some of the Epstein files released today, it is worth considering. What would an innocent person do? What would someone who is mentioned in the Epstein files do if he or she believed that he or she is totally innocent of any wrongdoing with Jeffrey Epstein? Former President Bill Clinton's office put out a statement saying, quote, "We call on President Trump to direct Attorney General Bondi to immediately release any remaining materials referring to, mentioning, or containing a photograph of Bill Clinton." And there it is. That is the model for how you handle this situation if you are in the Epstein files and you believe you did nothing wrong. Please feel free to now consider all of the prominent names you have heard this year associated with the Jeffrey Epstein, who have not demanded the immediate release of any materials referring to, mentioning, or containing a photograph of that person. Donald Trump has never demanded that. Donald Trump has done everything he could to prevent that from happening. Jeffrey Epstein's biggest business partner, Les Wexner, has never said, "Release everything about me that's in the Epstein files." And he is not saying it now, after his name emerged today in a 2019 Justice Department email titled Co-Conspirators. The email described attempts to subpoena the list of co-conspirators, which included Ghislaine Maxwell, A legal representative for Mr. Wexner told the New York Times that he was not a target of the federal investigation or considered a co-conspirator. He provided federal prosecutors with background information on Mr. Epstein and was never contacted again, the representative said. So I guess that settles that. If a lawyer for Mr. Wexner of Ohio says he did nothing wrong, that must settle it. I would love to have that lawyer for Mr. Wexner of Ohio join us here on this program and tell us whether he responded to a grand jury subpoena and whether he testified to the grand jury. I'd love to have Mr. Wexner of Ohio come here and tell us all about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which no one has ever been able to understand or explain. Mr. Wexner is so much richer than Jeffrey Epstein could ever have dreamed of being, and no one's ever figured out why Les Wexner would be in business with Jeffrey Epstein in any way. So what was that all about? And we patiently await Mr. Wexner's lawyer issuing a statement saying that they demand immediately the release of all information in the Epstein files about him and any photograph of him in the Epstein files. We patiently await that moment. There is no indication that Donald Trump was on the list of co-conspirators. But here is what Donald Trump said about Jeffrey Epstein's most important co-conspirator after she was convicted of sex trafficking with Jeffrey Epstein.
I just wish her well, frankly. I've met her numerous times over the years, especially since I lived in Palm Beach, and I guess they lived in Palm Beach. But I wish her well, whatever it is.
Yes, he did see her numerous times over the years. New information from the Epstein files today revealed that Donald Trump flew on Jeffrey Epstein's plane in the 1990s more often than he has ever admitted. In fact, Donald Trump has told the lie that he never flew on that plane. At least 4 of the Trump flights on the Epstein plane included Ghislaine Maxwell among the passengers Donald Trump was flying with. Donald Trump wishes Ghislaine Maxwell well. Donald Trump did not issue a statement today demanding the immediate release of any remaining materials referring to, mentioning, or containing a photograph of Donald Trump. Another email about co-conspirators released today said, quote, of the 10 co-conspirators, 3 have been located in Florida and served grand jury subpoenas, 1 in Boston, 1 in New York City, and 1 in Connecticut were located and served. 4 of the 10 are outstanding with attempts having been made. 1 is a wealthy businessman in Ohio. The remaining 3 are currently out of pocket. The team is flying out tonight, tomorrow to various locations in Florida to interview approximately 25 victims. If you were a wealthy businessman in Ohio who knew Jeffrey Epstein and you think you did nothing wrong, wouldn't you release a statement today, just like Bill Clinton's, demanding the release of any materials referring to, mentioning, or containing a photograph of yourself? Les Wexner is a wealthy businessman in Ohio and has not released any statement like that. If you're one of the prominent people living in the Boston area who has been publicly associated with Jeffrey Epstein, wouldn't you release a statement today demanding the release of any materials referring to, mentioning, or containing a photograph of you if you thought you did nothing wrong? Bill Clinton is the only person mentioned in the Epstein files who issued a statement demanding the full release of any remaining materials referring to, mentioning, or containing a photograph of Bill Clinton. And so, investigative reporting will continue about the possible 10 co-conspirators. More released documents by the Trump Justice Department might eventually identify those co-conspirators. But if you are a co-conspirator of Jeffrey Epstein's, your life changed today. And now it is only a matter of time. If you are a co-conspirator of Jeffrey Epstein's, you should know tonight that the clock is ticking on your secret. If you are a co-conspirator of Jeffrey Epstein's, you should know tonight that you have a rendezvous with the truth coming your way. Thanks entirely to a law passed by Congress to release the Epstein files, a law that could only be passed, not because any billionaire wanted it, but could only be passed because the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, who are now the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein, brought the moral clarity to Washington that demanded the release of those files over Donald Trump's objection. Those files have been released and will continue to be released over the objection of Donald Trump's Attorney General, Donald Trump's FBI Director, Donald Trump's Deputy Attorney General, who is Donald Trump's personal criminal defense lawyer. They all told the world in April that there was no reason to release a single document from the Epstein files and that the case was absolutely closed. They told the world there were no co-conspirators. They told the world there was no possibility of ever investigating or prosecuting anyone else for any kind of involvement in the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Donald Trump and his Attorney General and his Deputy Attorney General and his FBI Director have spent the year turning the Trump Justice Department into the Trump Criminal Defense Law Firm. The Trump Justice Department no longer represents the interests of the United States. The Trump Justice Department represents and defends Donald Trump, and that is why they fought the release of the Epstein files. We don't yet know how much of the redacting of the Epstein files involves redacting the word Trump. But we do know that the completely corrupted Trump Justice Department is capable of continuing to try to cover up whatever they believe they need to cover up for Donald Trump in the Epstein files. The Trump Justice Department is and will remain completely corrupted. They therefore have no credibility at all in anything that they say about the Epstein files. And so when Todd Blanche tells you that something is fake in the Epstein files, like a handwritten letter from Jeffrey Epstein to another pedophile in prison, Todd Blanche should not be able to convince anyone that that letter is fake. There are real reasons to believe it is fake, and there are ways of determining it is fake. But Todd Blanche does not have the credibility necessary to make that case. So all of the assessment of what is and isn't fake in the Epstein files will be made outside of the Trump Justice Department, because the Trump Justice Department is completely corrupted and there to do nothing other than try to defend Donald Trump. Todd Blanche lied today in a written statement about the Epstein files, saying that any of the negative information about Donald Trump in the Epstein files, if true, quote, certainly would have been weaponized against President Trump already. That is a lie. That is Todd Blanche pretending that the Biden Justice Department or the Obama Justice Department were corrupt like the Trump Justice Department. The Epstein files contains a claim by Jeffrey Epstein's brother that he believes, without evidence, that Donald Trump had Jeffrey Epstein killed in prison. The brother offers no evidence of that. There is no evidence of that. And that claim existed in the Epstein files during the Biden presidency. And no one in Merrick Garland's Justice Department ever dreamed of releasing that information. No one weaponized that unfounded claim by Jeffrey Epstein's brother. Since Todd Blanche works in a completely corrupted Justice Department, he knows what he would have done with statements like that about an enemy of Donald Trump's. Marjorie Taylor Greene has seen enough. The Republican member of Congress who built her entire political career on enthusiastic support for Donald Trump, but then lost Donald Trump's support when she demanded the release of the Epstein files, said today, "This is horrifying. Trump called me a traitor for fighting him to release the Epstein files and standing with women who were raped, jailed in stalls, and trafficked to men. Only evil people would hide this and protect those who participated. I pray for these women." Donald Trump tried to hide it. Donald Trump's Attorney General tried to hide it. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer, now his Deputy Attorney General, tried to hide it. Donald Trump's clownish FBI director tried to hide it. Only evil people would be co-conspirators of Jeffrey Epstein. Evil people like Ghislaine Maxwell, who Donald Trump wishes well.
Just breaking right now across the wires, President Trump is ordering a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going into and out of Venezuela, saying that the armada around Venezuela will only get bigger, and that the Venezuelan regime has been designated a foreign terrorist organization, crossing on all the wires coming from the Trump administration and the president himself. A blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers into Venezuela. As we look at some of those drug boat takeouts, that's a significant move around the country of Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, Brett, it's incredibly disturbing. I think this is why you're seeing members of Congress on both sides of the aisle coming forward and saying, you know, we need to understand a little bit more about what the posture is and what the reasoning and rationale is. It's one of the reasons why we have, checks and balances in this country, and why the legislative branch is so involved when there is a decision to go to potentially invade or even potentially go to war with with another country. So lots of questions here. I think that President Trump, I know he's speaking to the country tomorrow night, addressing the nation. I think it's very important that he be transparent with the American people as to why he's doing this. And, I think a lot of people are asking questions. Are we going to actually go into war with Venezuela? More questions here than we have answers.
Yeah, Ari, the president is saying, and maybe tomorrow night in his primetime address, which you'll see here on Fox, he's going to get into this. Some of the specifics. It's not that we don't hear from this president a lot. We hear from him a lot on a lot of moves. But tonight he's saying this blockade, it's a significant move.
Yeah, I think for most of the American people, everything vis-a-vis Venezuela is unexplained. I don't think the American people understand or know, have probably never even heard of him for the most part, Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and what's wrong with him? What's our beef with him? What's our beef with Venezuela? President Trump hasn't explained it thoughtfully to the American people. So it's a lot of tough, knee-jerk action that's pretty good against drugs. I support it. The action against the tankers. In most cases, in the case previously, that was under a warrant, and that tanker was an unauthorized tanker. It wasn't even flagged, which is a violation of international law. So he has good reasons, but he's not explaining them. And I think if he wants the support of the American people for another foreign venture, he needs to explain it.
Yeah, Meredith, right now they're forecasting that tomorrow's primetime speech is going to be kind of the hits up until this point, but I assume it'll be some of this as well.
Yeah, I think people are looking for answers on many fronts, and we're getting to the time of the year. It's about 1 year into Trump's first year here back in the White House, and the White House wants to look ahead to the midterms. They want to talk about the economy and what they're trying to do here, but what we've seen more recently is a lot of distractions, whether it's this Vanity Fair article or even the president's comments about Rob Reiner yesterday that were really disturbing to a lot of people on the Hill.
The U.S. ramping up yet more pressure on Venezuela, announcing new sanctions on shipping companies and vessels, which the administration says help move Venezuelan oil. It comes after the U.S. seized a sanctioned oil tanker, which the administration says was carrying millions of dollars worth of oil off Venezuela's coast. Caracas says Washington has now suspended deportation flights that were scheduled to land there today. A U.S. official says that's not true. Stefano Pozzebon, he's in Caracas, and he joins us now. The deportation flights, that's interesting because one could argue that's one space where the two countries are, if not working together, right? They're maintaining contact, and the U.S. is deporting these people back to their home country. What more details are you learning?
Yes, exactly, Jim. It's crucial to point out that those deportation flights that have occurred with regularity, frankly, over the last several months, were the only area where there was direct communications, where there was a coordination between the government of the authoritarian leader here in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and the White House, indeed, because also those flights were managed directly by ICE, the government agency in charge of removing undocumented migrants from the United States. But the fact that we are seeing that today that flight did not take place, and the Venezuelans saying that it was a unilateral decision from Washington, as a sign that the temperature is rising here around Nicolas Maduro in particular. One other point, for example, is that we had not seen military people on the screen here in the Venezuelan television for the last few weeks, perhaps as Maduro wanted to portray the picture that he was ready to sit down and speak with Trump and try to mediate. Well, a couple of hours ago we did see the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who, by the way, is also accused by Washington of being a narco-trafficker with a bounty of $25 million on his head, and this had him to say about the growing tensions on the Caribbean.
Que nadie se equivoque con Venezuela.
Let's not fool ourselves around Venezuela. We've seen efforts to intimidate us, sending United States armed aircraft close to our coasts. We, with great humility, we say don't fool yourselves. We're ready to defend this country.
We're ready to defend the country. Once again, a return to the type of rhetoric that we've seen in times of heightened confrontation. And I think I want to point out to three areas, three main issues that are happening in this standoff between Washington and Caracas. There is, of course, the deportation flight. And if those flights were indeed stopped because of a decision from Washington, that is the number one issue for the Trump administration. If those have been stopped, it's because something is really happening in the same place. Jim.
Stefano Pozzebon, thanks so much for following. for more reaction now to U.S. pressure on Venezuela. Joining me, Representative Adam Smith, Democratic leader on the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for taking the time.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. It's good to see you.
So we're now seeing a mix of tactics here. You've got the military buildup. You have these deadly strikes on drug boats and alleged drug boats. You have the seizure of an oil tanker. Now you have these sanctions. Is it clear to you, or is it clear to the American people, what the ultimate goal is of the Trump administration here? Is it war?
Yeah, it's not clear at this point. You've heard a lot about the desire to stop the very real problem that we have in the U.S. with drug abuse. But blowing up a few boats with cocaine on them in the Caribbean doesn't seem terribly connected to that. And then, of course, you have Trump pardoning, the convicted drug dealer, former president of Honduras. That seems inconsistent. What is clear is that President Trump wants to assert U.S. dominance in Latin America. We saw this in the national security strategy that the White House released last week. And that's troubling. That should not be our policy. And it's also clear that he wants to force Maduro out of power. He's also mentioned he's not fond of President Petro in Colombia. So the U.S. getting involved in potential regime change operations in Latin America is deeply troubling. Because if we learned anything from the last 25 years, it should be that regime change is a dangerous path to go down, and the U.S. should be out of the regime change business.
I wonder, do you believe or have any sense of how far Donald Trump is willing to go, right? Because Admiral James Stavridis made the point on our broadcast yesterday that this is the biggest buildup of military power in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? When the U.S. and the Soviet Union nearly went to nuclear war. Do you believe that this is buildup for actual military action, perhaps even on the ground in Venezuela, or more of a bluff?
We don't know. I mean, I think it's absolutely clear President Trump wants to flex, basically. He wants to show the power and strength of the U.S. Where he takes that, I don't know. I mean, I remember a quote about President Trump from the first term that someone once said, when you don't know where you're going, you're always on the right path, as one way to describe President Trump. And he tends to bluster forward and see where it goes. And in this case, it's really dangerous. I mean, we're actually killing people in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Ocean, and international waters. We are putting a ton of pressure on different governments, all without congressional authority, by the way. This is a massive expansion of the use of the U.S. military without any congressional authority. And it seems to be the polar opposite of what President Trump ran on. Remember, he was going to get us out of forever wars. He was going to stop international interdictions and focus more on issues closer to home. So not knowing where he's going and seeing the belligerence of what he has done to date, it's an alarming combination.
You and others on the Hill still have questions about that double tap strike. But Republicans, including Republicans who initially were at least uncomfortable and some quite critical of that double tap strike, seem to be satisfied now with what they've seen. If Republicans are no longer on board for an investigation, can you properly investigate that in the U.S. decision-making going forward?
Well, it's more mixed than that. And the answer to your question is no. I mean, we can do it. We're going to keep pushing from our side, the Democratic side, but it's a lot harder if you don't have the majority. Now, the Republicans have been mixed on that. I mean, Mike Rogers, chairman of the committee, said this morning that he wants to hear from the lawyer who gave the legal opinion on that double tap strike. And that seems like he still wants to pursue the investigation. So I'm going to keep pulling at those cracks to try to get the full and complete investigation that we need. Because what's on that video, Republicans are not describing it accurately. Number one, this should be released publicly. I should stop having to defend this. Let's release it to the public, and then we can see who's right. By the way, I'm very confident that we're right. I know what I saw. We know what we saw. Republicans are deflecting from that. But second, what is the legal authority here? I mean, Admiral Bradley says that basically the military now has the authority to kill anybody affiliated with any one of 24 different narco-terrorist groups, to kill those individuals, even if they have drugs. A massive expansion of the power of this president and the U.S. military to kill people. We shouldn't be doing that so lightly and so frivolously.
Final question before we go, if we can. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse made the point on this broadcast earlier in this week. Okay, I see the argument for seizing Venezuelan oil tankers, trafficking and illegally in oil against sanctions, etc. Why isn't this administration doing the same to Russian shadow fleet tankers, doing quite the same thing, funding the ongoing war in Ukraine? Do you understand that contradiction, one could call it?
Well, I mean, I think you understand that contradiction from something we talked about a moment ago, which is President Trump's worldview. It's not so much about who's illegally shipping oil from Iran or Russia. It's about his desire to assert U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere in a very 19th century way. And by the way, that 19th century approach led to a whole series of world wars, culminating in World War II, which killed nearly 70 million people and almost basically wiped out the planet. That's not a good policy approach. We should stick with the rules-based international order and respect for sovereignty.
Congressman Adam Smith, appreciate you joining.
The Trump administration continues to bomb ships and increase its military presence in the Caribbean. So is the U.S. planning a regime change in Venezuela? And could this spark an all-out war? This week on Upfront, I'll ask those questions to Alan McPherson, professor of history at Temple University, specializing in U.S. Latin American relations. Alan McPherson, thanks so much for joining me on Upfront.
Thank you very much.
President Trump has mobilized 15,000 U.S. troops, as well as warships, fighter jets, and a nuclear submarine off the coast of Venezuela in what is the region's largest military buildup in decades. And President Trump has recently said that, or at least threatened that he will attack Venezuela, quote, very soon. How do we get here?
Oh my God, I mean, it's largely because of this administration, the things that it wants to achieve, although I'm not sure exactly what they are. I mean, there's a long history, obviously, of Venezuela being a thorn in the side of the United States. This administration, in its first mandate, wanted to get rid of President Maduro, and now I think you've got a certain cast of characters who are now in power under Trump. They've got different motivations, and they've decided to act on them. So,
who is this cast of characters?
Yeah, I mean, two are very important. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, clearly wants to show what he calls lethality, right? He prefers sort of the show rather than the results. So he wants to blow up ships in the Caribbean. He wants to show the power of the U.S. military, especially of the Navy. And so I don't think he particularly cares what the result is as long as he gets to sort of show off his hardware. But then you've got Marco Rubio, who's much more interested in the politics of Venezuela, right? He's much more invested in Latin American politics, hates the Cuban regime, and hates the Venezuelan regime. They, of course, are allies. If he's able to somehow change the regime in Venezuela, he takes out a huge amount of petroleum that is helping the Cuban regime sustain itself. And I think that, I don't think he particularly cares about promoting democracy, but if he's able to portray himself as somebody who changed at least one socialist regime to a democracy, he'll be very popular in Florida.
And by democracy, we mean capitalist regime.
Yes. Well, we mean, a regime that maybe has elections, right? Or at least restoring the leader that actually won the elections in 2024 and having that leader installed or one of his allies installed in Venezuela. And I think he would do some damage to Cuba, and I think he'd positioned himself for a run in 2028 as the president who sort of brought some democracy to Latin America.
So you mentioned two different kind of strands. One is the show of lethality, as you called it, and the other is the kind of ideological shift. Let's start with this lethality thing, yes. Because the Trump administration has claimed, without evidence, I might add, that drug cartels and those linked to the boats are unlawful combatants, threatening U.S. national security, and that the U.S. is engaged in a, quote, non-international armed conflict. This is very specific language. When I think about that language and the performance of lethality that you're talking about, to what end are these things being used?
One end that it's not being used for, at least in this instance, is actually stopping drugs from coming to the United States. And that's sort of odd. I think what the intention is to overthrow this regime, to weaken socialism in Latin America, to sort of warn all other leaders in Latin America who are somewhere on the left not to confront the Trump administration. I think there is a desire certainly to stop the flow of migrants from Venezuela to the United States. I mean, you got to remember there's something like 8 million Venezuelans who have fled their country in the last 10 years or so. A couple 100,000 of these have come to the United States. I mean, that's obviously a thorn in the side, and that's a perfectly legitimate problem to want to end. Drugs coming up to the United States is also a perfectly legitimate problem. And of course, by blowing up boats that may or may not contain drugs, you might deter others, right, from bringing drugs, at least at sea.
And you stop narco-terrorism, which is one of the arguments.
Well, that's the other concept here that's got a strange history, and that is very important in sort of legitimizing the legality of this. Before essentially the 1980s, you never heard this word narco-terrorism. It basically means someone who's a cartel leader who's doing something who's committing violence for political means, right? Pablo Escobar is one of these people, right, for political ends. But then in the Bush administration, in the context of the Iraq War, they started calling everybody in Colombia that they didn't like, mostly leftist guerrillas, as narco-terrorists. And that essentially allows you to wage war on them and to sort of call them enemies of the United States who are somehow attacking the United States. But think of it, even if they are on a ship bringing drugs to the United States, they're criminals. They're not in any way terrorists. They're not doing anything political. So it makes no sense whatsoever, except if you want to justify a war against the country that they're coming from.
So let's say that's the case. This is used to wage some kind of war against, in this case, Venezuela. What does Hegseth get from this performance of lethality? What does he get if you're saying it's not actually about the end result for him, it's about the destruction itself, like the violence is the point? Why?
I think he and President Trump both sort of like the show of force. And they feel that they gain in political power by doing so, that they can sort of dominate the Republican Party. I mean, I'm sure Hegseth is thinking about his political future also. And so he would be sort of the tough candidate, right, who's sort of tough on crime, tough on immigration, tough on leftists around the world, and revived, right, the sort of pride and militarism in the United States.
Is there a thoughtful legal strategy behind the Trump administration's rhetoric as well? I mean, using the language of unlawful combatants and talking about being in an armed conflict, does that shield them from some of the scrutiny or maybe even international accountability for what effectively would be human rights violations, what effectively would be the contravention of international law?
I mean, I think there's sort of two legal justifications. One is for sort of killing these people on these boats, right, by calling them unlawful combatants, by saying that these folks are bringing war and insurrection into the United States, and therefore you can invoke the Insurrection Act against them. But the other one is actually taking down Maduro. And on this, I think they are following the legal model of Panama 1989. So back then, you had a dictator who was involved in drugs, and there was no question about that. What they did was they were able to say, one, he is not the leader of the country, and Noriega was actually not the formal head of state, so they could do that, which means, two, they could indict him on drugs, and three, they could invade the country on the simple legal pretext of arresting this one man. But of course, it changed the regime. Now they've done 1 and 2 against Maduro. They've said, yes, he's the head of state, but he didn't win the election in 24, therefore he's not the legal head of state. He's been indicted in U.S. courts on drug charges. So all we've got left is number 3, which is we go in and arrest him.
This then, as you invoke Panama, suggests that this isn't a new U.S. policy. Trump is just being more transparent about ousting a leader. When we think about authorizing CIA operations, when we think about sort of publicly saying his days are numbered, this is just U.S. policy.
It is. I mean, the problem, it's a continuation of the way the United States has often acted. I mean, it's important to understand that this hasn't happened since 1989. So in many ways, it's a departure from the last many decades. But at the same time, I mean, this is much more dangerous than Panama, right? Panama was a leader who was the head of a large police force, didn't have much of a military. He was surrounded by American soldiers in the Panama Canal Zone. It's a small country, small population. They were never going to be able to defend themselves much. Venezuela is enormous. It's got 30 million people. It's got hundreds of thousands of people in their military. We don't know how they would align if there was an invasion. There are no U.S. forces there. They're apparently now blocking certain routes to get from the sea into Caracas. And so they are preparing for invasion. They've been preparing for a long time. It would not be a cakewalk like Panama was relatively.
The Pentagon has faced major bipartisan backlash for the double taps. The double tap strikes. Effectively, they are repeatedly bombing a boat in order to kill survivors. There's no real way to justify that legally. But the idea of framing this as a uniquely Trump thing is odd to me, given, for example, the Obama administration's drone strikes. To what extent are we overstating the uniqueness of Trump and his approach and his contraventions of international law? And to what extent are we kind of underplaying this long history, really on both sides of the political aisle of this stuff happening?
No, I think you're right. And you're getting to the fact that this is sort of the naked exercise of American imperialism, which has always been there. It has never essentially left, right? America has always had plenty of power in the Americas. It has been relatively restrained in that power since the end of the Cold War. It's mostly emphasized things like trade deals, economic power. But I think people like Trump are realizing we're being outplayed by the Chinese in Latin America. They are taking a lot of the trade, which he thinks it's their trade, and they're taking it away from us. They're building ports, they're occupying these ports, they've got strategic assets. If you've seen the latest strategic statement of just last week, clearly what he wants to do is reassert the Monroe Doctrine, which basically was always a veneer of saying we don't want outside powers in Latin America. But the real reason for it, at least in the whole 20th century, was to sort of assert American dominance. Now they're calling
it... In the entire Western Hemisphere.
The entire Western Hemisphere. Now they're calling it American preeminence, in the Western Hemisphere. And it's interesting that Latin America is now the first region in the world that is sort of, talked about in this national security strategy. So yeah, it's a resurgence of imperialism.
Marco Rubio, as you referenced earlier, is sort of on a similar mission. As Secretary of State, he's effectively said, we have to destroy communism. We have to free Latin America from these despotic regimes. How much of that is rooted in his own history and his own background?
I mean, there's some of that because he's a Cuban American, right? He's been sort of raised in this Cuban American Florida environment.
Who fled
yes,
Cuba?
His family fled
when
Cuba.
the Batista regime was overthrown.
He grew up with these folks. He hates the communists. And, it's a perfectly legitimate thing for a sort of capitalist Western government to want to do, to sort of weaken communism around the world. The problem, though, is that it's sort of a continuing problem that we had in the Cold War, which is that you replace communism with anti-communism, not necessarily with democracy, right? You can call it democracy, but more often than not, it wasn't. It was just anti-communism, and it was very repressive.
What are some examples of that?
Chile, Guatemala, the attempts in Cuba, Argentina, Brazil, example after example, Iran in the Middle East, of the United States and the CIA basically saying, we're going to ally with whoever's the strongest anti-communist. Of course, if they happen to also be able to competently run a democracy, that's fine. We don't oppose that. But even at some point, Kennedy says, I'd rather have a strong man than a weak Democrat. Because what I really want is an anti-communist. Right. In this case, he was talking about the Dominican Republic. And that's essentially what they got in Dominican Republic also.
For Trump, is it really about the ideological outcome? Does he actually care about uprooting communism and socialism, or is he simply playing to his base? Is this a political vision of his, or is this really about him sort of advancing the agenda of his supporters, people who are anti-communist, for example?
I mean, I think it's really not about anti-communism. That's part of the rhetoric. But I think overwhelmingly, you see this also in this national strategy document. It's a pretty sort of nakedly extractivist strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, Venezuela is sitting on the biggest oil reserves in the world.
I want to read a quote to you. Back in 2023, Trump himself said after his first term ended, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. I mean, you can't be more sort of clear than that in terms of speaking about an agenda. How much are oil interests and the priorities of the corporations driving Trump?
Yeah, I mean, there's no clear evidence, right, of these oil corporations influencing them, but the sort of breakdown in negotiations gives us a hint that that's what they want. Plus, they've sort of said it, of course we want the oil. And they know that if these sort of more U.S.-friendly Venezuelans come in, they will give much better deal to American oil corporations. They had great deals in the 1990s. And Hugo Chavez came in and not only, raised the costs of doing business, but also diminished the amount of oil that was pumped by Venezuela. I mean, it used to be something like 3 million barrels a day. Now it's about 1 million barrels. I mean, you can admire socialists for all sorts of reasons, but they're not very good at running businesses, right? And the oil company in Venezuela also became very corrupt. It was a way to sort of place Chavistas in power. And those guys are not good at doing business. They're not engineers. They're not lawyers, right? They're just people who collect the money. And so it would certainly be better for the oil industry for the socialists to leave in Venezuela. And of course, people like Chevron know this.
While a few Latin American countries have condemned Trump's military threats and expressed their solidarity with Venezuela, direct regional support for Venezuela has been relatively limited. Meanwhile, a number of Central and South American countries are backing the U.S. against Venezuela. Does this reflect a kind of broader political realignment under Trump?
I think so. I think there's been a rightward shift under Trump. Part of it is due specifically to not wanting to be in any way associated with Venezuela, right, and not suffer any of the military consequences. Part of it are leaders who are gaining directly, politically, or monetarily from being associated with Trump, right? Leader of Argentina, for instance, leader of Honduras. Very soon we're going to have a right-wing leader in Chile. I think they are a sort of mini Trumps, and they sort of gained from Trump backing their candidacy in their countries. And so there's all sorts of motivations. Plus, you have to remember Latin America is as divided politically as the United States are, right? You've got pretty extreme populist leaders in just about every country in Latin America, or at least candidates for presidency. So it's swinging from left to right. The media is very much divided between left and right, just like the United States. So you've got the same sort of polarization. And increasingly, the right in Latin America is identifying with Trumpian-type politics, right? And not sort of more traditional Catholic, pro-elite, pro-business politics. They're really populist, they're anti-immigrant, they're anti-crime. And so they just identify and understand with the priorities that the Trump administration has in Latin America.
I want to talk a little bit about Maduro in particular. Maduro's repression of political opposition and erosion of freedoms is well documented. The United Nations and other human rights organizations have talked about everything from enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, even torture under Maduro. There's also a severe economic crisis. There's a severe humanitarian crisis. Inside the country, there seems to be a groundswell or a call, at least, for change, for political change. How much of that groundswell could lead to support, or does lead to support, for outside intervention?
Yeah, that's hard to tell because we just don't have polls of what's going on in Venezuela. The latest poll, if you want to call it that, was the election of 2024, where clearly he lost by millions of votes, right? He overwhelmingly lost the election and then committed fraud to keep power. And so that's essentially what we know. We have to assume that not that much could have changed in 2024. Now, wanting the end of the Maduro regime, I think, is what most Venezuelans want. Wanting an outside interference, bring the end of the Maduro regime, I'm not sure. I think Venezuelans would be much less united on saying, oh yeah, let's bring the Americans in here. Let's bring tens of thousands of Marines, right? Maybe a few drone attacks here and there on maybe cartels, or maybe the kidnapping of the president. That might be relatively popular, but I think the stationing of American troops in Venezuela will not be popular. And I'll note that invading a large Latin American country has never happened in American history.
That's interesting because we've now talked about Maduro not legitimately winning that election in 2024, and dozens of countries have refused to recognize that victory. The party associated with opposition figure Maria Corina Machado was widely believed to have won. Machado was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to bring a democratic transition to Venezuela. She's also a proponent of foreign military intervention, privatizing oil, U.S. sanctions, and she is strongly praising Trump these days and has for quite some time now. What would it mean for Venezuela if an opposition figure like that were to rise to power?
It's hard to tell because there's no free media in Venezuela. Groups are divided. One would hope that there would be a peaceful transition and hopefully an election, a fair election, to really determine what Venezuelans, want and who they want to have in power. But let's say she just comes to power with U.S. support, maybe with some military support. Venezuela would quickly turn to neoliberalism, right? You'd essentially have a shift that you might have had in Chile in the 1970s, where all of a sudden everything's privatized. It's sort of, American corporations are let in, corporations from all over are let in. All aid to Cuba is cut. And so I think it would be, significant sort of damage to some Venezuelans, to some Cubans, to the left in Latin America. Most Latin Americans, they don't want Maduro. They don't like him at all. He's unpopular. So almost anybody would be better than him. There'd be a lot of relief, but it would certainly be a shift to sort of a more neoliberal economy.
One of the things, I want to return to this drug trafficking thing for just a moment, because at the same time that Donald Trump has vowed to stop Venezuela's alleged drug trafficking through military force, he's also pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 45 years in prison by a U.S. court last year. Juan Orlando Hernandez was at the center of what U.S. officials said was, quote, one of the largest and most violent drug trafficking conspiracies in the world. how do we square these types of contradictions? Not just in Trump's mind, because who knows, right? But in the court of public opinion, will Trump be able to continue to say, I'm waging this extraordinary war on drugs that allows me to blur all the lines and transgress international law and do all these things, if on the other hand, we see these types of moments?
To me, it makes total sense because it's not a war on drugs, right? If it was a war on drugs, they would target actual cartels, the biggest cartels and the biggest sources of drugs coming into the United States. It would be Mexico, it would be Colombia, it would be Ecuador, the countries that are producing and moving drugs the most. They are freeing someone who probably just has friends in the administration. It's probably not that complicated. They really don't care about the drugs that he brought in along, several years ago. As for Venezuela, it's not a transshipment place for a lot of drugs. It certainly doesn't produce any fentanyl, right? So there's just sort of lies at the very bottom of this. I don't think the Trump administration cares about drugs at all, at least in these two policies.
Is any of it also about domestic policy? I ask that because they're not just targeting Venezuelans at sea, but also targeting them here in the United States, using the same narco-terrorist rhetoric to justify deployment of military in U.S. cities, also deporting people. We saw more than 240 Venezuelans deported to a mega prison in El Salvador. Do you see a link between these sort of hyper-aggressive foreign policy moves? Do you see a link between those and the increased militarization and immigration policy here in the United States?
Yes. I mean, again, I think this is generally though about anti-immigration. I think this is Stephen Miller in the administration who wants to get rid of any immigrants, whether...
Everyone,